Planning and Preparation, Autumn 1944. By autumn of 1944, the Allied forces had been making significant gains against the Axis powers. However, the German forces, despite suffering major defeats, were not willing to go down without a fight. Hitler, in a desperate bid to reverse the tide of the war, started planning a major offensive. His plan was to break through the lightly defended Ardennes forest, just as he had done successfully in 1940, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. By doing this, Hitler hoped to split the British and American forces and encircle and destroy 4 Allied armies, forcing a negotiated peace in the Western Theater. The operation was codenamed Watch on the Rhine, and massive amounts of resources were pulled in secrecy. German soldiers were trained in the use of captured American vehicles and weapons to sow confusion among the enemy. English-speaking soldiers were prepared to infiltrate behind enemy lines to disrupt communications and supply lines. Meanwhile, the Allies, confident in their imminent victory, ignored signs of German preparations. The Ardennes sector was considered a quiet sector, with the American lines held thinly by new, inexperienced divisions and others recuperating. It was in this state of complacency and underestimation of the enemy that the stage was set for the surprise German counteroffensive that would lead to the Battle of the Bulge. Little did the Allies know, they were about to face the bloodiest battle for American troops in all of World War II. A battle marked by bitter fighting in freezing weather, a horrifying massacre, and an unforgettable reply by an American general that would symbolize the unwavering resolve of the American forces. German offensive begins, December 16, 1944. On the morning of December 16, 1944, under the cover of a dense fog that grounded the Allied air forces, more than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks launched Hitler's audacious offensive. Their target, an 80-mile stretch of the front line in the lightly defended Ardennes forest. Catching the Allied forces off guard, the Germans quickly overwhelmed the American defenders. Towns were captured and recaptured in quick succession as the Germans pushed westward, creating a bulge in the Allied lines. This initial phase of the German attack, also known as the breakthrough, saw the American troops scrambling to hold their lines against the powerful German offensive. Despite being heavily outnumbered and outgunned, they put up a desperate fight. One of the key struggles occurred at St. Vith, a vital road junction for the German advance. American defenders there held the town far longer than the Germans expected, delaying the advance. On December 17, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, more than 80 American prisoners of war were murdered by their German captors near Malmedy, Belgium. The soldiers were part of Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, U.S. 7th Armored Division, and were captured by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe, part of the 1st SS Panzer Division. Those who survived did so by feigning death. The massacre was later investigated by a U.S. military commission in the Dachau trials of 1946, and several German officers and soldiers were sentenced for their involvement. This event was one of the deadliest war crimes committed by German forces against American soldiers in World War II, and deeply shocked the American public and military community. Despite the valiant defense put up by the American forces, by Christmas Eve, the German advance had created a pronounced bulge, some 50 miles into the Allied line. The Battle of the Bulge was far from over, but the tide was about to turn. Allied response and defense, mid-December 1944. The initial surprise of the German offensive had caught the Allies off guard, but they were quick to respond. As the scale of the German attack became clear, the Allied High Command moved swiftly to counter the threat. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, called an emergency meeting with his senior commanders on December 19th to coordinate a response. Reinforcements were rushed to the Ardennes, including General George Patton's Third Army, which was directed to drive north and relieve the besieged defenders of Bastogne. Meanwhile, the American soldiers on the front lines, though outnumbered and encircled in places like Bastogne, resisted with determination. These soldiers, many of whom were green troops from service and support units, turned into hardened fighters almost overnight. Their tenacity in defense, combined with the rugged terrain and worsening winter weather, slowed the German advance and bought the Allies precious time. The strategic town of Bastogne became a symbol of American resilience during this period. Despite being surrounded and pounded by German artillery, the troops under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe refused to surrender. McAuliffe's legendary "nuts" reply to the German surrender ultimatum boosted the morale of his troops and inspired resistance across the Allied line. The weather, which had initially helped the German advance by grounding the Allied Air Force, began to clear by December 23rd. This allowed the Allies to bring their air superiority into play, attacking German supply lines and dropping supplies to their own besieged forces. By the end of December, despite being battered and stretched, the Allied line had held. The German advance had been stopped, setting the stage for a counteroffensive. As 1944 came to a close, the Allies were preparing to push back. Siege of Bastogne, December 20th, 27, 1944. The Battle of Bastogne was one of the most crucial confrontations within the larger Battle of the Bulge. Nestled in the center of a road network vital to both the Allies and Germans, Bastogne's strategic location was a major prize for whoever controlled it. The Germans needed the city to solidify their grip on the region and speed up their offensive, while the Allies needed it to halt the German advance and launch a counteroffensive. On December 20th, the Germans laid siege to the city, which was defended by the 101st Airborne Division and Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. These forces, despite being surrounded and heavily outnumbered, were determined to hold the city at all costs. The troops inside Bastogne, short on ammunition, food, and medical supplies, faced freezing conditions and constant bombardment from German artillery. Despite these hardships, their morale remained high. The situation became dire on December 22nd when the Germans sent a surrender ultimatum to General McAuliffe. His reply, a terse and defiant "nuts," became a rallying cry for the defenders of Bastogne. The Germans continued their assault, but the defenders held firm, frustrating the enemy's attempts to break through their lines. The skies finally cleared on December 23rd, allowing Allied aircraft to bombard German positions and drop much-needed supplies to the besieged troops. The tide began to turn on December 26th when tanks from General Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines to relieve the defenders. By December 27th, Bastogne was secure, though sporadic fighting continued in the area. The defenders had successfully withstood the German onslaught, marking a crucial turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. The siege of Bastogne stood as a testament to the tenacity and resilience of the American forces and became an iconic episode of World War II. Allied counteroffensive begins, December 26, 1944. After a brutal week of battle, the tide began to turn in favor of the Allies on December 26th. The beleaguered troops in Bastogne, after a desperate last stand that had garnered them worldwide admiration, were finally relieved by General Patton's Third Army. This marked a critical turning point in the Battle of the Bulge and the beginning of the Allied counteroffensive. As the weather improved, the Allies were able to fully mobilize their air power, providing much-needed support to their ground forces and devastating German positions. The RAF and USAAF attacked German supply lines, hampering their ability to reinforce and resupply their front lines. On the ground, the Americans and British launched coordinated assaults. To the north, British Field Marshal Montgomery's forces attacked from the Meuse River, pushing the Germans back. In the south, General Patton's Third Army, having broken through to Bastogne, continued their aggressive drive northward. The determined counterattacks forced the German forces to retreat. The towns and territory they had taken at a heavy cost began to fall back into Allied hands. The massive German gamble, intended to change the course of the war, had failed. By the end of December, the German advance had not only been halted, but was being gradually pushed back. This marked the beginning of the end of the Battle of the Bulge. The German army, already stretched to its limits, could not withstand the renewed Allied offensive. The Allied counteroffensive would continue into the new year, ultimately culminating in the complete recapture of all territory lost during the initial German offensive. This marked the final major German offensive of World War II, with the Allies pushing onwards to Germany in the subsequent months. German retreat, January 1945, and aftermath. By the beginning of January 1945, it was evident that the German offensive had failed. The relentless pressure from the Allies, coupled with logistical issues and the harsh winter conditions, led to an inevitable German retreat. Hitler, ignoring the advice of his military strategists, had tried to hold on to his gains in the Ardennes, but the situation had become untenable. On January 8, 1945, Hitler ordered a withdrawal, marking the official end of the offensive. German troops began to pull back to the Siegfried Line, the same defensive line they had started from just weeks earlier. This marked a significant turning point as it signaled the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. The toll of the Battle of the Bulge on both sides was staggering. The Germans suffered an estimated 67,200 casualties, and the Allies around 89,500. It was the bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. In the aftermath, the German forces were severely depleted and could no longer launch an offensive of the same scale. The failed Ardennes offensive had consumed much of Germany's remaining resources and reserves. Meanwhile, the Allies had gained a crucial psychological victory, overcoming a significant surprise attack and demonstrating their resilience and determination. The battle had also highlighted the tenacity of American troops, particularly during the siege of Bastogne. The nuts reply by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe when surrounded and asked to surrender had galvanized the troops and captured the world's attention. The Battle of the Bulge marked the last major German offensive on the Western Front. After this, the way was open for the Allies to invade Germany, and within 4 months, Hitler would be dead, and the war in Europe would be over. But the memory of the Battle of the Bulge lingered on, a testament to the brutal reality of war, and a reminder of the courage, sacrifice, and resilience of those who fought in one of the fiercest battles of World War II.